Very, very good afternoon to you. 12:35 is the time. This is Talk the Home of Common Sense to me, Julia Hartley-Brewer. Sam Armstrong's still with me. Delighted to be joined now by Wallis Simons. He's editor of the Jewish Chronicle here in London, but he's also author of the brilliant book, Israelophobia, the newest version of the oldest hatred and what to do about it, published before the October the 7th massacres and the start of the war in Gaza. But my goodness me, still a very important read. Jake, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we are looking at just days away from a Trump inauguration and a presidency of Donald Trump, where he had said if there isn't a deal, a hostage return done before he gets into power, you know, all hell will break out. A lot of pressure on Joe Biden to do something, to get a deal on the table, signed and sealed before his final days as US president. We're now told it's looking like it's on the brink by Joe Biden. We've had Hamas said they had accepted a draft agreement for a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip and the release of dozens of Israeli hostages, according to officials involved in the talks. We've heard a lot of this before. How hopeful are you that this time it really could happen?
Very hopeful indeed. It seems like this is going to happen. I mean, you never know, never say never, but it does seem that hopes are high that this will get over the line. And largely it does seem to be the result of Trump talking tough, raising the question, of course, what if Biden would have talked tough last year? What would we have seen then? But look, you know, it is what it is. We are looking at a deal, hopefully, and it will be a three-phase deal. The first phase will involve the release of, it's thought, 33 Israeli hostages, women, the elderly and the wounded, including, there are hopes that it would include Emily Damari, the British hostage, the 28-year-old woman who's held there, the Spurs fan, as well as 5 female Israeli soldiers. Now, in return, Israel will release a lot of prisoners, 50 prisoners for each of the 5 female soldiers for a start, and commence the withdrawal from Gaza. This will be a 6-week phase. Phase 2 will be a complete Israeli withdrawal in return for all of the remaining hostages. There are 98 living hostages, it's thought, being held in Gaza. And then the final phase will involve the release of the bodies of the remaining hostages and the commencement of a reconstruction plan. So it looks like a serious plan that will lead us to where we want to go, but nerves are high at the moment because it isn't yet over the line.
Indeed. And look, I mean, again, if you were a member of the family or friends of those who were held hostage, that's your #1 priority. But there are other priorities for any government, particularly for the Benjamin Netanyahu government, in terms of preventing future October the 7th as well and the rebuilding of Hamas. Now, they have done, I would say, frankly, a magnificent job of helping to destroy not just Hamas, but also Hezbollah as well, and making Israeli people safer after that awful massacre on October the 7th, 2023. But 465 days in, priority of getting those hostages back, particularly, oh my God, for me, the young children, but also particularly the young women. We know, I mean, we know people who've been released have been beaten and tortured, treated, I mean, horrifically, but we also know about the treatment of these women as sex slaves. I mean, basically being brutally raped. It doesn't even bear thinking about some of the horrific things that have emerged. But, of course, there's also a concern about releasing a load of prisoners, Hamas terrorists among them, back free into Gaza. Hamas being allowed to rebuild. There's a lot of talk. I mean, Joe Biden was talking about, you know, ready for his Democrat supporters, talking about, you know, reconstruction of Gaza. But we know what happened when aid money went in to build Gaza and build a new country for Palestinians living there. It went to Hamas to build tunnels so they could harbour terrorists to launch an attack on October the 7th. So I can understand why many in Israel, particularly the right wing of his government, who I wouldn't agree with on pretty much anything else, are concerned that they're just paving the way for another massacre. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, we do need to try to get our heads around the fact that we're dealing with an enemy here, Hamas, that only wants one thing, which is death and destruction. This is really the definition of evil. They don't want a state. They don't want liberation. They want the deaths of Jews and Israelis. That's what they want. And the only reason why they're being pushed towards this deal is because of the pressure that you just mentioned, the destruction, almost complete destruction of Hezbollah, the fall of Assad in Syria, and the real weakening of Iran, plus Trump coming in. All of this is bringing huge pressure to bear upon them. But of course, from on the Israeli side, we want to see, or the Israelis want to see, those hostages home. But don't forget, Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October the 7th massacres was himself released in a prisoner exchange. In 2011. He was one of 1,027 prisoners released in exchange for one Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit. And he, of course, went on to design and lead the October the 7th atrocities. Now, he said Israel's got his body. Hamas wants the body back as part of the negotiations. Israel at the moment is not agreeing to do that. But it just highlights how important it is that Hamas is completely destroyed and unable to carry out such an October the 7th atrocity again, as they have declared that they want to.
Yes, I mean, they've declared again and again, and we're often told, with moderate Palestinian leadership. There isn't any moderate Palestinian leadership. I've interviewed someone who's apparently moderate Palestinian leader who was cheering on the massacre 3 or 4 days. Well, we knew the detail, well, some of the most horrific details of what happened on October the 7th, was still cheering it on and calling it a great victory for Palestinian people. And this is the concern, isn't it? Now, a lot of this has been brokered by Qatar, and again, happily harbouring Hamas terrorist leadership. They're the ones who aren't living in the tunnels. They're living in their penthouse suites, aren't they, in their multi-million-pound homes in Qatar. But I mean, this is the thing. The question is, like, what happens in the future? There's no doubt at all that, Hamas has had a huge amount of losses. I listened to Radio 4 this morning, the usual, tens of thousands of people have died in Gaza. Yes, and best part of 220,000 of those deaths in Gaza have been Hamas terrorists. We should be cheering that on in the same way we would be cheering ISIS terrorists being killed or Al-Qaeda terrorists being killed. But because it's in Gaza, obviously we have to pretend they're all women and children. There's no doubt at all that the Democratic Biden administration has been, basically trying to, play both sides on this, giving support and succour to Benjamin Netanyahu and to the Israeli people, Biden flying to Israel, the day after the massacre, but also at the same time, basically, often condemning perfectly reasonable defensive actions by the Israeli military to kowtow to woke Democrat supporters in America. What do you think is going to change on Monday when Donald Trump is in the White House?
Well, there was a fascinating interview that the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, gave to the New York Times last week, in which he commented that whenever there's been a perception of daylight between the US and Israel, Hamas has hardened its position, prolonging the war and refusing to do a deal to release the hostages. Now, that daylight didn't emerge by accident or by fluke or by an act of God. It emerged every time President Biden criticized Israel publicly, talking about it going over the top, for example. That was a famous phrase that he used. As a result of those sorts of comments, Hamas became more emboldened, thinking they could win by wearing down the American-Israeli alliance, perceiving that daylight to work in their favor. Now, when Trump comes in on Monday, I think we'll see far less of that kind of daylight. I mean, no one really knows what we're going to see from Trump, but there's an expectation or a hope that we will see a much more full-throated support of Israel and uncompromising support against the jihadist terrorists that are threatening it from Gaza, who, of course, would threaten us all if they could. And that hopefully will lead to a more comprehensive and clear victory against Hamas, which will be ultimately to the benefit of the region in terms of peace.
Yes, and to the benefit of the Palestinian people as well, because they're the organisation.
Free Palestine from Hamas, I think, should be what we're all chanting at the moment.
Absolutely. Really good to talk to you, Jake. Wallis Simons, the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. Sam Armstrong, you've been staunch on this. Whenever I get hatred on social media about my stance on Israel, my God, I'm more and more convinced about how right I was. I don't think it's up to discussion. I don't want innocent children and people to die in Gaza, but that's entirely the fault of Hamas, not the fault of Israel, who are simply defending themselves. But if you were the Israeli Prime Minister, would you want this deal?
Do you know what? I'm not actually sure I would. It seems an extraordinary price to pay 50 terrorists for a single hostage. And that is who you're dealing with. You are dealing with a nasty, despotic, terroristic regime that tolerates no dissent. Any Brit that moved to Gaza would be summarily arrested and executed in short order for expressing
including
the
the Queers for Palestine. I'm sure they'd be very welcome.
Ludicrous organisation on earth. And look, it is a tough deal, and I don't like the idea of Hamas surviving at all, because I do think we're going to be here again. And when a terrorist tells you what they're like,
Believe them the first time. I think is that there's an argument, isn't it, that they're not going to be able to destroy Hamas, and therefore getting these people back. I have to say, seen some of the images. There was a video recently of one of the young women held captive, and looking at the video, and the parents have asked for only a couple of images to be used and not the full video because let's remember her, in her happier days. But again, if it was my child.
Of course,
it's very different.
The Prime Minister of the country's got to govern for the whole country and not just those.
There's also
families.
an argument that the power that that holding the hostages has given Hamas. If you just said, we're not negotiating, end of. If everyone dies, so be it on you. There is an argument that would prevent future hostage taking. There is that argument, and again, that's the we don't pay ransoms argument from many Western governments. Again, the French paid ransoms again and again, kept having their hostages taken because they knew that they would be tens of millions of pounds being paid. But again, very different if it's your family, very different in those scenarios. But it is extraordinary. But whenever anyone, this wokerati on social media just say, we want peace in Hamas, we always say, have you tried giving the hostages back? It's all you've got to do. You stole people, babies, women, children, the elderly. If you give them back, or if you hadn't taken them in the first place, none of this would have happened. This is on Hamas. This is on them, solely on them. End of story. 12:46 is the time.